I was on the floor of a mansion I didn't own, my hands slick with cooking oil that wasn't mine, and the last thing I remember before the pain took over was thinking, not again, not this leg again. Somewhere upstairs a door slammed. Somewhere behind me a young man was already dialing a phone to tell his friends what he'd done. I didn't know yet that this fall would be the thing that finally made Richard Calloway look at my face and remember it. My name is Andre Wallace. I was 37 years old the year everything happened, and if you'd told me 5 years earlier that I'd end up scrubbing another man's kitchen floor to keep my daughter alive, I would have laughed you out of the room. I used to stand in front of Marine Corps recruits and tell them that pain was information, not a verdict. I used to believe that. Then my wife Denise died on a Tuesday in October, and 8 months later the company that laid off half its warehouse staff decided my name belonged on that list too. And I learned that pain doesn't care what you used to believe. I have a daughter. Her name is Maya. She was 7 that year, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with a stuffed rabbit named Colonel, and living with a heart condition called hypoplastic left ventricle that the doctors had patched together with 2 surgeries already and were watching for a third. Watching costs money. Cardiology costs money. The specialist 40 minutes from our apartment costs money we did not have after I lost that warehouse job. And the little bit of disability I still drew from the Corps wasn't going to cover a third open-heart surgery on a little girl's chest. I'd served 12 years as a combat medic, 2 deployments. I'd pulled grown men out of vehicles that were still on fire and packed wounds with my bare hands in the dark. I came home with a shrapnel scar along my left calf that still aches before rain, and a habit of counting exits in every room I walk into. None of that translated into a resume that impressed anybody in a city full of people who wanted to know what software I knew. So when the staffing agency called and said a private household needed a house manager, cooking, driving, light maintenance, live out, paying enough to cover Maya's specialist visits with room left over, I said yes before they finished the sentence. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked why 9 people had already quit that job in under 2 years. The house belonged to Richard Calloway, a man whose name was on half the shipping terminals on the East Coast. His wife had died 3 years before I arrived, and somewhere in that grief, he had let his son run wild with money and no direction, the way rich men sometimes do when they can't stand to say no to the last piece of their wife they have left. That son's name was Tyler. He was 24. And every staff member who'd worked in that house before me had a story about him, and every story ended the same way, with somebody packing a bag and never coming back. I met Tyler on my 2nd day, kneeling in the garden pulling weeds, because the last man hadn't gotten to it before he quit. Tyler circled me the way you circle something you're deciding whether to break. So you're the new one, he said. Did the agency warn you? They told me your father needed help managing the house, I said. That's all I needed to know. He smiled like I'd told a joke. Everybody who's worked here left crying. Some didn't make it a week. Pack light. I didn't know it yet. But the reason Tyler needed every maid and every driver and every cook to fail was bigger than cruelty for its own sake. I'll get to that. It matters more than you think. That first month, I learned the rhythms of the house the way I once learned the terrain of a base camp, where the light hit the kitchen windows in the morning, which floorboard in the hallway creaked, what time Richard Calloway left for his office, and what time he came home too tired to notice anything at all. And I learned Tyler's rhythms too. He tested people. Small things first. My 3rd week, I came back from the market with 2 bags of groceries stretched across 40 minutes of haggling to make the household budget cover the whole week, and he was waiting at the door with a bucket of water. "You're late," he said, and threw it over me before I could set the bags down. The rice and the produce hit the stone. I stood there dripping in the afternoon sun and said nothing, because I had learned a long time ago in triage tents that the loudest reaction in the room rarely helps anybody. "Maybe now you'll remember the time," he said, and walked back inside. I picked up what I could salvage of the groceries and went to change into a dry shirt, and I thought about Maya's next cardiology appointment, and I put the water bucket out of my mind the way I used to put a bad night out of my mind before the next shift started. A week after that, he locked the laundry room and dangled the key at me with a grin, told me the lock was acting up, and I washed an entire basket of linens by hand outside, under the sun, while he watched from an upstairs window like it was entertainment. When I brought him dinner, he'd requested a dish I'd looked up specifically because he'd mentioned missing his grandmother's cooking. He took one bite, called it bland, and threw the bowl at my chest. Sauce ran down my collar onto a floor I had mopped that same morning. I didn't flinch this time. I'd stopped flinching. I reached for a cloth and wiped the counter like nothing had happened, because something in me had decided that this job, this house, this paycheck was the only bridge between Maya and the surgeon she needed, and I was not going to let a 24-year-old with a grudge against the world burn that bridge down. There was a small victory in there, though, if you looked for it. Richard Calloway had business partners over for dinner one night in my first month, and Tyler announced loudly at the table that guests shouldn't expect much because the new help is still learning. I saw the flicker of embarrassment cross Richard's face. He didn't say anything that night. But later, after the guests left, he found me alone in the kitchen washing dishes past midnight. "Andre," he said. It was the first time he'd used my name instead of just nodding at me. "I know my son hasn't made this easy. I'm managing, sir," I said. "Every person who's worked here before you told me the same thing, right up until they resigned," he said. "Why do you keep telling me you're fine?" I set down the plate I was drying. "Because I don't want to be one more reason for the distance between you and your son, sir. I don't know the whole story of what happened in this house, but I know what it looks like when a man buries himself in work because he can't face what he lost. I've done it myself." He looked at me a long moment, like I'd said something he hadn't expected to hear from a member of his household staff. "You continue to surprise me, Andre." I didn't tell him why I understood grief that well. I hadn't told anyone in that house that I was a widower or that I'd buried people overseas whose names I still say to myself on bad nights. There's a version of this story where I explain all of that to him right then, and everything speeds up. That's not what happened. What happened is, I went home to my apartment, checked on Maya sleeping with Colonel the Rabbit tucked under her chin, and went to work again the next day, because that's what you do when quitting isn't a door that's open to you. I remember exactly what that first month smelled like, because I've learned that smell is the sense that sticks longest. The Calloway kitchen smelled like lemon oil polish and expensive coffee beans. Nobody but me actually brewed correctly. The garden smelled like cut grass and the chlorine drifting over from the pool house. And underneath all of it, on the mornings I walked that back hallway before sunrise, there was a faint mineral smell off the marble that reminded me, more than I liked, of the smell of a field hospital tent at 4 a.m., bleach and cold stone, and the particular quiet of a place where people are trying not to make noise. I told myself, more than once that first month, that I could survive anything that came with a paycheck attached. I'd survived worse. I'd survived 2 deployments, survived watching men I'd trained with not come home, survived sitting beside Denise's hospital bed for 11 days straight before the doctors told me there was nothing left to try. A spoiled 24-year-old with a grudge did not, on paper, belong anywhere near that list. What I hadn't accounted for was how differently exhaustion works when it's slow and constant instead of sharp and sudden. You can steel yourself against an explosion. It's much harder to steel yourself against 100 small cuts spread across 4 months, each one small enough that complaining about it out loud would sound, even to yourself, like weakness. Patrice warned me on my first week, quietly, refilling a water pitcher so it looked like small talk to anyone watching. "He tests everybody the same way," she told me. "Start small, sees how far he can push before you break, or before you push back. The ones who broke, he got bored of fast and made their lives worse until they left. The ones who pushed back, he found a way to get them fired within a month, made sure his father heard some story that made it look justified." She looked at me carefully. "You want to survive this house, Andre? You don't do either. You do exactly what's asked of you, exactly as well as it can be done, and you let him get tired of getting nothing back." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I'd lived a few more weeks of it myself. I want you to understand something before I tell you what came next. There was a night, maybe 6 weeks into that job when Tyler's friends came around the pool house while I was clearing dishes, and I heard one of them say something to him that I didn't think much of at the time. I'll come back to that conversation. It would matter more than any of us knew. The trouble with cruelty is that it escalates when it doesn't get the reaction it's hunting for. Tyler had thrown water on me, thrown food at me, locked me out of rooms, embarrassed me in front of guests, and I had absorbed every one of it without giving him the satisfaction of watching me break. That should have ended it. Instead, it made him angrier, because somewhere in his mind, my composure looked like defiance, and defiance from someone he'd decided didn't belong in that house was intolerable to him. There was a small win in there I wanted to tell you about, because the story isn't only humiliation, it's the ups and downs, and I lived every one of them. One afternoon, I found Richard Calloway sitting alone in his study, staring at a framed photo of his late wife, the kind of stillness a man gets into when the house is too big and too quiet. I didn't say anything, I just brought him a cup of coffee the way I remembered him taking it, black, no sugar, and set it down without a word, and left. 20 minutes later, he found me in the hallway. "Thank you for that," he said. "Nobody's done that in a while. It was such a small thing." But I drove home that night with something like hope in my chest for the first time in months, thinking maybe this house wasn't only going to take from me. I should have known better than to let my guard down. 2 days later came the gut punch. Maya's school called. She'd had a dizzy spell in the cafeteria, nothing catastrophic, but enough that they wanted her picked up and checked. I asked for 2 hours off. Tyler happened to be in the kitchen when I made the request to the house steward, and he laughed. Loud enough that I heard it from the hallway. "Everybody's got a sob story when they want time off," he said to no one in particular. I got the 2 hours anyway. Richard approved it without hesitation when he heard, but Tyler made sure I knew, in a dozen small ways over the following days, that he thought my daughter's health was a convenient excuse. I have never in my life wanted to put my hands on someone the way I wanted to that week. I didn't. I went and sat in a hospital hallway, holding my daughter's hand instead, because that's what actually mattered. There was a tiny recovery after that. One of the older household staff, a woman named Patrice who ran the kitchen and had somehow survived 4 years in that house, started leaving me a plate of food at the end of long shifts without ever mentioning it, the way you do for somebody you've decided is one of the good ones. Small kindness from someone who understood exactly what that house could do to a person. It kept me going more than she probably knew. Then came the bigger loss, the one that still sits heavy in my chest when I think about it. Richard was traveling for a week on business. Tyler, with his father gone and no one to answer to, told me my presence in the house was no longer required while his father was away, and that if I showed up again before Richard returned, he'd tell his father I'd stolen from the house. I knew it was a lie. I knew he had no proof, because there was nothing to have proof of. But I also knew that in a house like that, a rich son's word carries weight a hired man's does not, and if that accusation stuck, I would lose the only income standing between my daughter and the surgeon she needed. I didn't know it yet, but that threat was the closest that house ever came to actually breaking me. I called Patrice from the parking lot that night, and for the first time since Denise died, I let myself cry in the car with the engine off. Rock bottom doesn't always look like the biggest disaster in a story. Sometimes it's a grown man alone in a Honda Civic in a gated driveway, terrified that a 24-year-old's lie is about to cost him his daughter's heart surgery. I want to tell you about 3 things I noticed during those weeks that I didn't understand yet, 3 small pieces that would matter later, because I flagged them at the time without knowing why. The first was a framed photograph in Richard Calloway's study of a much younger version of himself in civilian clothes, standing next to a Humvee somewhere that was clearly not American soil, next to men in uniform I didn't recognize. The second was a business card I found once while dusting his desk from a private security contractor that specialized in overseas extraction, the kind of company that gets called when something has gone very wrong very far from home. The third was something Tyler's friend had said that night by the pool house, half joking, that Richard wouldn't be here at all if some medic hadn't dragged him out of that mess in the mountains 20 years back. I hadn't thought much of it in the moment. I would think about nothing else once I understood what it meant. There was one more thing that happened during that week. Richard was traveling, something I've thought about often since, because it's the clearest example I have of how close that house came to losing me entirely before the accident ever happened. Tyler cornered me in the pantry 2 days after his threat, holding a folder of receipts he claimed proved I'd overcharged the household for groceries. It was a lie built out of nothing, numbers he'd clearly altered himself, and for one long moment I genuinely believed I was about to be fired on the spot, with no witnesses, no recourse, and a daughter at home whose surgery fund depended entirely on the paycheck I was about to lose over a lie. "Say it," he told me, holding the folder inches from my face. "Say you've been stealing. Save us both the trouble of pretending you haven't." I didn't say it, because it wasn't true, and I have never in my life confessed to something I didn't do just to make another man's afternoon easier. I told him calmly that he was welcome to show that folder to his father the moment he returned, and that I would answer any question Richard Calloway had for me directly, in person, with every receipt from that pantry accounted for, down to the penny, because that's how I'd been running that kitchen since the day I started. Something in my refusal to fold seemed to surprise him. He put the folder away and didn't bring it up again, but I drove home shaking that night all the same, because I understood with total clarity how little it would have taken for a lie like that to end everything I'd built in 4 months. 3 days later, Richard returned early from his trip. I didn't know that yet either, standing in that hallway with a bucket of oil about to change everything. Here is where I have to take you back to the morning I started this story with, because now you have the context for it. Richard was due to be gone until Friday. Tyler decided that was his window. He'd been trying for months to get rid of me the way he'd gotten rid of everyone before me, and none of it had worked. And I think by that point, it had become something personal to him, a kind of pride wound he couldn't let go of. Later I learned what one of his friends had said to him at that cafe weeks earlier. Not hurt her, not anything that direct, just a lazy suggestion that maybe he should make staying in that house physically difficult instead of just uncomfortable. "Accidents happen every day," the friend had said. Tyler had laughed it off at the time, but bad ideas take root quietly when nobody's there to stop them, and by the time Richard left for his trip, Tyler had decided. Early that Wednesday morning, before I arrived for my shift, Tyler poured cooking oil across the polished tile just outside the pantry hallway, the exact route I walked every morning to start breakfast prep. He wiped the bottle clean and put it back like nothing had happened. I came in a little after 6, same as every day, said a quiet prayer the way I always did before my shift, something I picked up overseas and never let go of, and walked that hallway with a laundry basket in my arms. My foot hit the oil and went sideways so fast I didn't even have time to brace. I came down hard, the old shrapnel scar in my calf screaming in a way it hadn't screamed since the deployment that put it there, and for one disoriented second, I was back in a different country, on a different kind of ground. I heard my own voice before I registered I was making the sound. My ankle. Help me. Somebody, please. What I didn't know was that Richard Calloway had come home early that morning for a forgotten document, and he was still in the house when he heard me. He was down those stairs faster than I would have believed a man his age could move, and when he reached me and slid his hand beneath my shoulders to steady me, his palm came away slick with oil. He rubbed it between his fingers, brought it to his nose, and I watched something in his face change from concern to something colder and more focused. "This is oil," he said. "It couldn't have appeared here by itself." I couldn't answer him. The pain had my whole attention. But upstairs, I would later learn, Tyler was already on the phone with his friend, laughing under his breath, telling him he thought he'd finally done it, that I'd slipped and maybe broken my leg. Neither of them knew Richard was still in the house. Richard heard enough of it through the open door to know exactly who was responsible before he'd even finished getting me settled for the ambulance. "Minho, no, Tyler," I called for him, and his father's voice went through that house like something breaking apart at the foundation. Tyler came downstairs pretending he'd only just woken to the commotion, and found his father holding up an oil-slicked palm and staring at him with an expression I hope I never have directed at me in my life. "You did this," Richard said. "It wasn't a question. I just heard the noise," Tyler tried. "I've lived in this house 15 years," Richard said. "This hallway gets cleaned every night before bed. Oil does not appear on its own, Tyler. Did you do this?" The silence stretched long enough to answer for him. "I only wanted him to leave," Tyler finally admitted, unable to look at his father. "You wanted him gone," Richard repeated, voice gone dangerously calm, in the way that scares you more than shouting does. "So you decided breaking a man's leg was the answer." I was loaded into the ambulance with my ankle already swelling, the fracture bad enough that the paramedics wouldn't let me try to stand. My hands were shaking, not just from the pain but from something closer to shock, the same kind of shaking I remembered from watching men go into it after a blast, when the body finally lets itself react to something the mind had been holding off. One of the paramedics asked if I had anyone to call, and I gave her Patrice's number, because Patrice was the only person in that world who'd check on Maya for me until I could get word to my sister 2 states away to come stay with her. I remember Richard's face through the closing doors, and I remember thinking, whatever happens to me now, at least he knows the truth. In the emergency room waiting for X-rays, a nurse asked me what happened, and I found myself telling her flatly, factually, the way I used to give a report after a mission, because putting it into plain words was the only way I could keep from thinking too hard about what it meant that a grown man had deliberately set a trap in a hallway I walked every single morning. Fracture, tibia and fibula both, the doctor told me eventually. Surgical plate likely needed, 6 to 8 weeks non-weight bearing at minimum. I did the math in my head before he'd even finished the sentence. 6 to 8 weeks without my full paycheck. 6 to 8 weeks closer to missing Maya's surgery window entirely. I didn't know yet that none of that math was going to matter the way I thought it would. Back at the house, I learned later, the fallout moved fast. Richard called the family's attorney within the hour, not to press charges, though I think for a moment he genuinely considered it, but to have him present for the conversation he was about to have with his son, because he didn't trust himself to have it alone. Tyler sat in that study for nearly 2 hours while his father laid out point by point every resignation letter from the past 2 years, every complaint he'd quietly filed away and never acted on because he hadn't wanted to believe his own son capable of driving 9 people out of a job through cruelty. He told Tyler that this was the first time any of it had crossed into something that could have killed someone, and that it ended, completely and permanently, that day. I didn't know that unemployment, or something like it, was even a topic of conversation until Richard sat down beside my hospital bed himself that same evening, still in the suit he'd worn to whatever meeting he'd interrupted to come home for. "You're not losing a single day of pay over this," he told me before I could even ask. "Not one. And your medical costs from this are covered in full. Starting now, no discussion." It was the first time since the accident that I let myself actually exhale. I came home from the hospital that evening with a cast up to my mid-calf and a fracture bad enough to keep me off my feet for weeks, which meant, in the most immediate and terrifying sense, no income. Richard wheeled me himself into a guest room instead of sending me home, which surprised me more than the accident had. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said, sitting down across from me. "Please don't blame yourself, sir." "I will," he said quietly. "You were hurt under my roof, doing a job I asked you to do. And I promise you my son is going to learn something from this if it's the last thing I teach him." What he did next, I did not expect. He told Tyler that starting that day his life in that house was going to change completely. Tyler would cook every meal, clean every room, do every load of laundry, wash the cars, and personally see to my care until I was back on my feet. His car keys were taken, his accounts were frozen, no allowance, no ride to campus, nothing outside that house until he learned, in Richard's words, to do what was asked of him instead of what he felt entitled to. I watched some of that unfold from the guest room over the following days, and I will admit there was a part of me, a small, human, not particularly noble part, that felt something like satisfaction watching Tyler stand in that kitchen doorway staring at pots and ingredients he had never once in his adult life had to understand. The first morning, the smoke alarm went off because he'd set a pan on fire trying to make rice. The second attempt was a soup so oversalted even he couldn't finish it. He'd push it away with the same disgust he used to aim at every meal I'd cooked for him, except now there was no one else to blame. But something started shifting that I didn't expect either. Tyler started coming to the guest room to check on me, badly, awkwardly at first, setting a tray down without meeting my eyes and leaving fast, then staying a minute longer each time. Then, one evening about 2 weeks in, sitting down in the chair across from my bed without being invited. "I don't know how to do any of this," he said, meaning the cooking, but I think he meant more than that. "Nobody's born knowing it," I said. "You learn by doing it badly first." He was quiet a long moment. "Why didn't you ever fight back? Any of the times I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I thought about how to answer that honestly, because I'd promised myself a long time ago that I wouldn't perform gratitude I didn't feel just to make somebody else comfortable, because I have a daughter at home who needs a father who still has a job and still has his composure when he walks through the door. I said, "You weren't the hardest thing I've survived, Tyler. Not close. I just needed this job more than I needed to win an argument with you." That landed on him harder than I expected. He didn't say much else that night, but he came back the next evening and the one after that, and slowly, without either of us naming it, something between us started to change. At his college, the change was harder on him in ways I only heard about secondhand. Without the car, without unlimited money to spend on other people, the friends who'd surrounded him for years started drifting. Patrice told me she'd heard from someone that his friend Desmond and the others had stopped waiting for him at their usual table, that she'd overheard one of them say he was only useful when he had money. I think that was the moment it actually landed on Tyler what those friendships had been worth all along, and what my composure under his cruelty must have actually cost me for months. He never said that directly to me, but I noticed he stopped mentioning them at all after that. One evening, maybe 5 weeks after the accident, Tyler carried my dinner tray in himself, set it down carefully, and to my genuine surprise, got down on both knees beside the bed. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "I've said it before, but I didn't mean it before. Not really. I understand now what I put you through. I judged you before I knew a single thing about you, and I treated you like you didn't deserve basic respect because of the job you had to take. If you never forgive me, I understand." I looked at the young man kneeling by my bed, so different from the one who'd thrown a bucket of water on me 2 months earlier, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since Denise died loosened just slightly. "I forgave you before you learned to cook rice properly," I told him, and for the first time since I'd met him, he actually laughed through the tears. Neither of us knew that his father was standing outside the half-open door, having heard the whole thing. I didn't learn until much later how long Richard had stood there, or what it had cost him to stay quiet and let that moment belong entirely to his son and me. What I did notice, over the days that followed, was a change in how he looked at me, not the careful, grateful courtesy of an employer who felt guilty about an accident, but something closer to recognition, like a man squinting at a photograph trying to place a face he was almost certain he'd seen somewhere before. Twice that week I caught him staring at the old scar along my left calf when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The same scar the fall had aggravated, the one that still ached before rain. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was simple concern for an injury layered on top of an old injury. I had no idea he was doing arithmetic in his head that I wouldn't understand the shape of for another week. Here is the part of this story I still think about more than any other. The part where everything I'd been carrying quietly for years finally connected to the family I'd been working for without any of us realizing it. About a week after Tyler's apology, Richard asked me to sit with him in his study, the first time he'd invited me somewhere in that house as something other than staff. My ankle was still healing, so I came in slowly, and he waited without rushing me, which itself told me something had changed in how he saw me. He gestured to the framed photograph on his wall, the one I'd noticed months earlier and never asked about. Himself, younger, in civilian clothes, next to a Humvee, standing among men in uniform. 22 years ago, he said, I went overseas with a business delegation that got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Our convoy was ambushed. I took shrapnel in my side. Most of the men with me thought I wasn't going to make it out of those mountains. He paused. There was a combat medic who wouldn't leave me, carried me nearly 2 miles on foot to a rally point when the vehicle we had wasn't going to make it. I never learned his full name. Everyone called him Doc. I've spent more money than I care to admit over the years trying to track him down to thank him properly, and I never found him. I felt something cold move through my chest because I already knew, before he finished the sentence, exactly where this was going. Yesterday, Richard continued, I was going through some old service records with a friend who still has contacts from that era, trying one more time. And I found a name attached to the unit that responded to that ambush. Wallace. A. Wallace. He looked at me directly. Andre, is that scar on your left calf from an IED in the same region in roughly the same year I'm describing? I hadn't told anyone in that house the details of that deployment. I hadn't told anyone much of anything about it, not even Denise, not fully, because some of what happens overseas doesn't translate into dinner conversation. But I sat there and I told Richard Calloway the truth. That, yes, 22 years ago, I had pulled a wounded civilian contractor out of a burning convoy in those mountains and carried him almost 2 miles, because the vehicle we had wasn't going to survive the terrain, and that I had never learned what happened to the man I'd carried, because medics rarely get follow-up on the people they save. You patch them, you move them, and then the war takes you somewhere else before you ever get their name. Richard sat back in his chair like the air had gone out of him. You, he said quietly, it was you the entire time. You've been in my house for months. You carried my life on your back once, and I let my son treat you like you didn't belong here. I didn't have an easy answer for that. Some coincidences are too large to explain, and some are exactly the size the universe decides they need to be. What I told him was the truth, that I hadn't recognized him either, not fully, not until he described the ambush in enough detail that the pieces clicked into place, because 22 years and a different set of clothes changes a man's face more than people expect, and because I try, on purpose, not to hold on to every face from that period of my life, for my own sake. Why didn't you tell me sooner, he said, once you suspected? Because I wasn't sure, I said, and because, sir, I need you to hear this clearly. I didn't take this job hoping it would connect to something I did 22 years ago. I took this job because my daughter needs a heart surgery I cannot afford, and you paid enough to get her closer to it. That's the whole truth. I would have carried you out of those mountains whether or not it ever led back to me standing in your kitchen. He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rawer than I'd heard from him before. Then, let me be equally honest with you. I have spent 3 years since my wife died running this house like a fortress, keeping everyone at arm's length, because grief made me terrified of losing anyone else who mattered, and in the process I let my son grow up angry and lonely and surrounded by people who fed that anger, because it was easier than parenting him myself. You walked into the middle of that with more patience than my own family had left for one another. I owe you a debt I can't calculate, Andre, and I intend to start paying it starting today. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, because gratitude that large is not an easy thing to receive when you've spent months being treated like you didn't belong in the room. I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't carried him out of those mountains hoping for anything in return, that a medic doesn't calculate future favors while he's got his hands inside somebody's wound trying to keep them breathing. But I also told him something I hadn't said out loud to anyone since Denise's funeral, that I had spent so many months since losing her feeling invisible, feeling like the world only saw the uniform I used to wear or the mop I currently carried, and never the man standing between them. And that being recognized, actually recognized, by someone whose life I had once held together with my own two hands, meant more to me than any amount of money he could offer. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," I said. "I'm telling you because you asked me to be honest, and I think you and I have both spent the last few years pretending things didn't hurt as badly as they did." Richard nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I watched a rich and powerful man let himself look genuinely undone in front of someone who worked for him. "My wife would have liked you enormously," he said finally. "She always said I surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear. You never did that, not once, not even when it would have been easier for you. We sat there a while longer, two men who'd both lost someone, who'd both been carrying more than either of us said out loud, finding out that the thread connecting our worst days had been quietly running between us the whole time, without either of us noticing. What happened next moved faster than I expected, though nothing about it felt undeserved. Richard insisted on covering the full cost of Maya's cardiac surgery himself, not as charity, he was very specific about this, but as partial repayment of a debt he considered decades overdue. He connected me directly with the surgical team at the same hospital system his own family used, the kind of access that normally takes months of waiting and thousands of dollars just to get an appointment. Maya had her procedure 11 weeks after that conversation in the study. I sat in that waiting room with my hands shaking the entire time, the way I imagine every parent does. And when the surgeon came out and told me it had gone exactly as planned, I cried in a hospital hallway for the second time in my life, and this time it wasn't from fear. I want to tell you about the morning of Maya's surgery, because it's the moment everything in this story was actually about, underneath the house and the oil and the 22-year-old debt. The pre-op nurse read her chart out loud before they wheeled her back, the way they do to confirm identity. Maya Wallace, date of birth confirmed, guardian Andre Wallace present. I signed the consent forms with my hand shaking so badly the signature barely looked like my own. Andre Wallace scrawled across a line that felt heavier than any form I'd signed in 12 years of military paperwork. Maya looked up at me from the gurney, groggy already from the pre-op sedative, and asked if Colonel could come with her. They let her keep him tucked under her arm all the way to the doors of the operating room. And I stood there in that hallway, the same kind of fluorescent-lit hallway I'd once carried a wounded man out of a very different kind of danger. And I made myself the same promise I'd made her the day she was born, that whatever it cost me, she was going to have a life bigger than the one circumstance had handed us. 6 hours later, the surgeon found me in the waiting room still wearing yesterday's clothes, and told me the repair had gone better than they'd projected, that Maya Wallace's heart, patched together twice already before that day, had come through a third time stronger than anyone had a right to expect. I don't remember walking to the recovery room. I remember her hand, small and warm, finding mine before her eyes had even fully opened, and I remember saying her name and mine out loud to no one in particular, just to make sure the moment was real. Tyler, for his part, didn't go back to who he'd been. His father kept him on household duties for months after my ankle healed, not as punishment anymore, but as something closer to an apprenticeship in humility, and Tyler asked, eventually, if he could keep some of it up even after Richard offered to end it. He started volunteering at a veterans outreach program near campus, quietly, without telling anyone at first, something Patrice mentioned to me before he ever brought it up himself. When he finally told me about it directly, he said he wanted to understand, even in some small way, what people like me had actually given up for people like his father. I told him that showing up consistently mattered more than understanding everything all at once, and he took that seriously in a way that surprised me every week after. I want to close every loop I opened for you at the start of this. The photograph in the study, the security contractor's business card, the offhand comment by the pool house about a medic in the mountains, all of it connected to the same 22-year-old debt Richard Calloway had been quietly trying to settle since before I ever walked through his gate. The threat Tyler made that week his father was traveling, the one that nearly cost me everything. Richard learned about it eventually too, and it became one more piece of the reckoning between father and son that summer. And the accident that started this whole story, the oil on the tile, the ankle I broke that morning, that fracture turned out to be the single event that finally forced two men who loved each other and had forgotten how to show it to actually look at one another again. 2 years later, I still work for the Calloway family. The work undersells what it's become. I run operations for a veterans transition foundation Richard funded and asked me to help build from the ground up, connecting former service members with civilian jobs the way nobody ever connected me when I came home. Maya is 9 now, healthy enough to run circles around kids twice her size at recess, and she still keeps Colonel the Rabbit on her bed, even though she insists she's too old for him. Tyler graduated and works alongside me at the foundation 2 days a week, and he's the one who suggested we name the mentorship program after the medics who never got properly thanked, which is its own kind of full circle I try not to think too hard about, or I start crying at my desk. Richard and I have breakfast together most Sunday mornings now, something neither of us has ever put a name to, except that it's become the kind of ritual you don't want to miss. He told me once that the day he found me on that hallway floor was the worst morning of his year, and somehow also the beginning of the best years he'd had since his wife died, and I understood exactly what he meant, because I've lived enough of my own worst mornings to know they don't always stay the worst thing that ever happened to you. The foundation has placed 41 veterans into stable civilian jobs in its first 18 months, a number Richard reminds me of more often than I remind him, like he's still trying to prove to himself that the debt is being repaid properly. Maya's last cardiology follow-up came back with her heart function stronger than the surgeons had projected, strong enough that they've moved her checkups from every 3 months to twice a year, which might be the single best sentence I've heard a doctor say to me in my entire life. And Patrice, the woman who slipped me a plate of food on my hardest nights in that house without ever making a show of it, still runs that kitchen, though these days she does it with a raise. Richard insisted on the same month he restructured everything else about how that household treated the people who kept it running. Tyler still calls me some evenings just to talk, usually about the foundation, sometimes about nothing in particular, and I've stopped being surprised by how much I look forward to those calls. He asked me once, almost a year after that morning on the hallway floor, whether I'd ever really forgiven him or whether I'd just decided it was easier to move forward than to hold on to it. I told him both things can be true at once, that forgiveness and moving forward aren't always the same decision, but in his case, watching him actually change, instead of just apologizing for the cameras, they'd ended up being the same thing for me. Some nights, usually when the weather's about to turn and that old scar on my calf starts aching the way it always has, I think about how close all of this came to never happening. If Richard hadn't come home early that morning for a forgotten document, he might never have found me on that floor himself, might never have smelled the oil on his own hand, might never have connected 2 decades of guilt to the man mopping his kitchen floor every night. If I had quit in those first hard weeks, the way 9 people before me had every right to, Maya would have gone without a surgeon this good, and I would have gone the rest of my life, not knowing that the man I carried out of those mountains 22 years ago had spent a small fortune quietly trying to find me. Chance put us in the same house, but it wasn't chance that kept either of us there long enough for the truth to catch up. That part was choice, made over and over, on ordinary days that didn't feel like they were building toward anything. If there's a moral I've come away with from all of this, it's this: dignity is not something other people can take from you just because they hold your paycheck in their hands. I absorbed a lot of cruelty in that house before anyone knew who I really was, and I never once let it decide who I was going to be. I think about that a lot, actually, how close I came to quitting in those first few months, how easy it would have been to walk away from a house that seemed designed to break me. I stayed because my daughter needed me to, and staying turned out to be the thing that saved both of us. So let me ask you what I ask myself some nights. What would you have carried, quietly without complaint, if it meant keeping the people you love safe? And how differently might you have looked at a stranger cleaning your floor if you'd known the whole story behind their hands? If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. There are more like it here. Stories about the people the world underestimates, and what happens when the truth finally catches up to them.